November 8th, 2019, 11:47 p.m., Seattle, Washington. The rain didn't clean Seattle, it just made everything slicker, harder to grip. Isla Brennan wiped down the counter at the iron skillet for the third time that hour. Her fingers pruned from the bleach water, the smell of burnt bacon and coffee grounds soaked into her skin so deep she couldn't remember what clean felt like anymore. The diner had been open since 1952, back when men came home from Korea and needed a place that stayed open when the nightmares wouldn't let them sleep. Now it fed the graveyard shift workers, the insomniacs, the people who had nowhere else to go at midnight on a Tuesday. Isla's feet throbbed in her sneakers. Discount Reeboks from the outlet mall, 4 months old, already splitting at the seams. She counted the bills in her apron pocket without looking. 120, 5 tens, 3 fives, 12 ones, $127. Enough to cover the interest payment on the medical debt, not enough to touch the principal, never enough to touch the principal. May Caldwell, the owner, poked her head through the kitchen pass-through, 62 years old with hands that looked like they'd been carved from driftwood and a beehive of steel gray hair that hadn't changed style since 1987. Her voice came out rough from 4 decades of unfiltered camels. "You look like hell, sweetheart. Go home. I'll lock up." Isla shook her head, tucking a strand of dark brown hair behind her ear. The motion was automatic, muscle memory from 1,000 shifts. Can't. Rent's due Friday, and Finn needs another $800 for tuition by Monday. The architecture program doesn't care that his sister works 2 jobs. May's expression softened, the way it always did when Isla mentioned her brother. The old woman had watched Isla raise Finn from the time he was 13 and she was 19. Watched her work doubles and skip meals, and wear the same 3 pairs of jeans until the denim went threadbare. "That boy's lucky to have you." Isla didn't answer. Luck had nothing to do with it. Their mother died in March 2017, lung cancer that ate through her faster than the chemo could fight it, and their father had been gone since Isla was 12. Heart attack at 41, right there in the living room, collapsed in front of the chessboard they'd been playing on. She'd learned CPR in Girl Scouts, but her hands had been too small, her compressions too weak, and by the time the ambulance arrived, Connor Brennan was already gone. The memories surfaced the way it always did, sharp and clean and permanent. Her father's last words, gasped out between dying breaths. "Tactics aren't about strength, kiddo. They're about sacrifice at the right moment." He'd been talking about chess. The Brennan Gambit, he'd called it, a variation on the Queen's Gambit that involved sacrificing both rooks to create a knight and bishop domination in the endgame. Isla had won her first tournament with it 3 months after he died. She never played competitively again. The board reminded her too much of his hands, the way he'd move pieces with such certainty, like he could see 10 moves ahead. She poured herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. The brew had been sitting for 2 hours and tasted like asphalt, but it was free, and it was hot, and that was enough. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Finn, sent 20 minutes ago. "Aced the structural engineering exam. Top score in the class. Love you, sis." Isla smiled despite the ache in her shoulders, the way her lower back screamed every time she bent over. Finn was going to make it. He was going to build things that lasted, design buildings that didn't crumble, create something permanent in a world that felt like it was always falling apart. She typed back quickly. "Proud of you. Money coming Friday. Don't stay up too late." The bell above the door chimed. Isla looked up, expecting a drunk from the bar 3 blocks down, or maybe a truck driver stopping for pie before the long haul to Portland. Instead, she saw a child. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, soaking wet from the rain, dark hair plastered to his forehead, shivering so hard his teeth clicked together. But it wasn't the cold that caught Isla's attention. It was his clothes. The boy wore a miniature 3-piece suit, tailored, the kind of thing that cost more than Isla made in a month. Armani, maybe Brioni. The vest had mother-of-pearl buttons, his shoes were Ferragamo, black leather, now ruined by mud and rain. On his left wrist, a watch that looked like a Patek Philippe, the kind collectors paid 6 figures for at auction. This was a Mercer Island kid. 18 miles from here, across the floating bridge, in the part of Seattle where houses started at $3 million and neighbors hired private security instead of calling the police. The boy stood in the doorway, water pooling around his feet, his eyes darting around the empty diner like a trapped animal. Steel gray eyes, unusual, almost translucent in the fluorescent light. He clutched something in his right hand, knuckles white from the pressure. A chess piece, a black knight, hand-carved from ebony, intricate enough that Isla could see the horse's mane, the knight's armor, the base inscribed with letters too small to read from this distance. Isla set down her rag and moved slowly, keeping her hands visible, the way her father had taught her when he'd brought home a stray dog that had been beaten so badly it bit anyone who came close. "Hey there, you okay, buddy? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't speak. He backed up until he hit the corner booth, booth number 7, the one with the rip in the vinyl that May kept meaning to patch. His breathing was too fast, shallow, the kind of hyperventilation that preceded a panic attack. Isla knelt down, making herself smaller, less threatening. Her knees cracked from the motion. 24 years old, and her body already sounded like her mother's had at 50. "My name's Isla. Do you have a name?" The boy's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His voice came out barely above a whisper, breaking on the syllable. "Cal." "Okay, Cal. You want some hot chocolate? On the house." He nodded once, a jerky motion that looked involuntary. Isla guided him to the booth, the one furthest from the windows, the one where the angle of the walls would hide him from anyone looking in from the street. Instinct. The same instinct that made her check the locks twice before bed, that made her walk with her keys between her knuckles when she left work after midnight, that made her know something was very, very wrong. She rushed to the kitchen, calling back to May. "Call 911, now!" May didn't ask questions. She grabbed the phone off the wall, the old rotary that barely worked, and dialed. Isla could hear her voice, flat and calm, giving the address, describing the situation. Average police response time in this neighborhood was 8 minutes. The clock above the register read 11:51 p.m. Isla made the hot chocolate the way her father used to, with real milk heated on the stove, Hershey's cocoa powder, a pinch of cinnamon. She grabbed a clean towel from the stack, warm from the dryer May ran in the back room, and brought both to booth 7. The boy, Cal, hadn't moved. He sat rigid, staring at nothing, the chess piece still clenched in his fist. Isla wrapped the towel around his shoulders and set the mug in front of him. That's when she saw it. A smudge of red on his white collar. Not a lot, just a small stain the size of a quarter, darkened to brown at the edges where it had started to dry. Blood. Type O positive, if Isla had to guess, based on the color and the way it had oxidized. She'd spent 6 months taking phlebotomy courses in 2016, thinking she might be able to get a better-paying job as a lab tech. The certification had expired, but the knowledge stuck. And it wasn't his blood. Cal had no visible injuries, no cuts, no scrapes, nothing that would explain the stain. Which meant someone else had bled on him, recently. Within the last hour, based on the coagulation pattern. Isla's stomach turned over. She looked at his arms, the way he held himself, the micro-flinches when she moved too quickly. There, on his left forearm, just below the sleeve of his expensive suit, a bruise. Fading from purple to yellow-green, 3 to 4 days old. The shape was distinct. Fingerprints. Adult male based on the size and spacing. Someone had grabbed this child hard enough to leave marks that lasted. The bell above the door rang again, not a chime this time. The door slammed open with enough force to crack against the wall, the handle punching a hole in the drywall May had just repainted last month. The air in the diner changed. It felt heavier, charged, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. 2 men walked in, not customers, predators. The first one was in his 40s, maybe 6 feet tall, built like someone who'd spent time in prison lifting weights in a yard with nothing else to do. He wore a cheap leather jacket that squeaked when he moved, and a scar ran from his right eyebrow down to his cheekbone, a thick, ropey thing that looked like it had been stitched by someone who didn't care if it healed straight. Isla's mind cataloged him automatically. Scar. Dominant hand, Right. Weapon bulge under left armpit, shoulder holster. The second man was younger, early 30s, lean and wiry like a meth head, but with expensive dental work visible when he smiled. He moved with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who'd killed before and expected to again. In his right hand, held low against his thigh, a Glock 19 with a suppressor screwed onto the barrel. The silencer made the gun look absurdly long, like something from a movie, but Isla knew enough to know it was real. Wolf. That's what her mind labeled him. Weapon visible, suppressor, 9mm, likely subsonic rounds to maximize silence. Scar scanned the diner, his eyes moving in a practiced sweep. Left to right, booths, counter, kitchen. He stopped when he found booth 7, found Cal. His voice came out like gravel scraped across concrete. Found him. Wolf raised the Glock, not pointing it yet, just ready. Isla didn't think, didn't calculate odds or consider consequences or wonder who these men were. She saw a man reaching for a weapon and a child frozen in fear, and her body moved before her brain caught up. "Hey!" Isla shouted, stepping into the aisle, blocking their line of sight to booth 7. "We're closed." Scar's expression didn't change. He took 2 steps forward, heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. "Move, bitch." Wolf's smile widened. He brought the gun up, 2-handed grip, professional stance. Former military, Isla's mind whispered. Knows how to shoot. "Last chance, sweetheart. Step aside." Cal let out a strangled whimper behind her. The sound cut through Isla like a blade. She thought about her father, about the way he'd taught her to think 3 moves ahead, to see the board not as it was, but as it would be. She thought about Finn, about the text message still warm in her pocket. She thought about the $127 in her apron and how it wouldn't matter if she wasn't alive to pay the debt. Then she stopped thinking altogether. Isla turned, grabbed Cal by the collar of his expensive suit, and shoved him under the table. The booth was old, built in the 50s when diners were constructed to last, made of solid oak, 2.5 inches thick. It could stop a 9mm round, probably. Maybe. "Stay down, don't make a sound." She turned back just as Wolf fired. The suppressor did its job. No bang, no explosion, just a soft thip, like a staple gun, almost polite. The ketchup bottle on the table next to Isla exploded, showering her in red glass and vinegar. She screamed, more from shock than pain, and grabbed the nearest thing her hand found. A ceramic napkin holder, the heavy kind, stamped with the iron skillet logo. She threw it with every ounce of adrenaline flooding her system. It wasn't a good throw. Her father had never taught her to fight, only to think. But fear gave her arm strength it didn't normally have, and the napkin holder spun through the air and connected with Wolf's forehead dead center. It didn't knock him out, didn't even drop him. But it stunned him, made him stumble back 3 steps, and 3 steps was enough. Isla vaulted over the counter, her hip clipping the edge hard enough that she'd have a bruise tomorrow if she lived that long. She crashed into the coffee machine, the industrial bun brewer that May had owned since 1994. Glass shattered. The pot broke, sending 2 hours' worth of sludge-like coffee across the counter. "Get the kid. I'll kill the girl." Scar's voice. Close. Too close. Isla scrambled on the floor behind the counter, her hands cutting on broken glass, searching for anything she could use. A knife, a pan, anything. Her fingers closed around cold metal. The taser. May had bought it after the robbery in June 2018, kept it plugged in behind the register. 50,000 volts. Isla had never used it, never even taken it out of the charger. She heard footsteps, boots crunching over glass. They were coming for Cal, the boy who wouldn't speak, who wore a suit that cost more than her car, who had someone else's blood on his collar and bruises shaped like fingerprints on his arm. Isla lunged up from behind the counter, the taser in her hand, and saw Scar reaching under the table. His hand was 6 inches from Cal's ankle. The boy had pressed himself into the corner, making himself as small as possible, his gray eyes wide and empty and so full of terror that Isla felt something crack open in her chest. She didn't yell a warning, didn't give him a chance to turn. She just pressed the taser against the back of his neck and pulled the trigger. The sound was louder than the suppressed gunshot. a sharp crack pop that echoed off the tile. Scar convulsed, his whole body seizing, and dropped like someone had cut his strings. He hit the floor face first, twitching, a low moan coming from his throat. Isla heard the click behind her, the sound of a gun's safety being released. She turned. Wolf stood 10 feet away, the Glock pointed at her chest. The barrel looked enormous from this angle, a perfect circle of darkness that seemed to swallow all the light in the room. His forehead was bleeding where the napkin holder had hit, a thin trickle of red running into his eye, but his hands were steady. His eyes were dead, flat. The eyes of someone who'd done this before and would do it again and felt nothing about it. You should have stayed out of it. Isla didn't close her eyes. She didn't want the last thing she saw to be darkness. She looked past Wolf at the clock above the register. 11:58 p.m. 10 minutes since Cal had walked through the door. The police wouldn't make it in time. May was probably hiding in the freezer, the way Isla had told her to during the robbery training. Cal was under the table, listening to the woman who'd given him hot chocolate, about to die. She hoped Finn would understand, hoped he'd finish school, hoped he'd build something beautiful. The gun blast was deafening. Isla felt nothing. No pain, no impact, no sudden darkness. She opened her eyes, not realizing she'd closed them. Wolf was on his knees, a hole the size of a quarter in the center of his chest, blood spreading across his cheap button-down shirt in a perfect circle. His face held an expression of mild surprise, like he'd forgotten something at the store. Then he fell forward, his face hitting the linoleum with a wet smack. Isla looked toward the door. A man stood in the entrance, framed by the rain and the sodium lights of the parking lot. He was tall, over 6'3", wearing a suit that made Cal's look like a knockoff. A long black wool coat hung from his shoulders, tailored, the kind of thing that cost 5 figures. His face was all angles, sharp cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from marble. His eyes were the same shade of steel gray as Cal's, identical, unmistakable. In his right hand, he held a Desert Eagle, .50 caliber. The gun was huge, almost comically large, smoke still rising from the barrel. Behind him, 6 more men poured through the door, moving with military precision, fanning out to secure the room. They wore matching black suits, earpieces, the coordinated movement of professionals who'd done this 100 times before. The man in the long coat didn't look at Isla. He walked past her, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence, and knelt beside booth 7. His voice was deep, commanding, but threaded with something that might have been fear if men like him were capable of fear. Callum. The boy crawled out from under the table, moving slowly, like he was underwater. He looked at the man and his face crumpled, not crying, worse. The kind of breaking that happens when someone who's been holding themselves together finally sees safety and realizes they don't have to anymore. Papa. The man, this Papa, scooped Callum up in his arms. For a single moment, a fraction of a second, he buried his face in the boy's neck, his shoulders tensing in a way that suggested he was holding back something huge and violent. Then the mask snapped back into place. He stood, cradling Callum against his chest, and turned to face Isla. She was still on the floor, kneeling in broken glass and spilled coffee, her hands bleeding, the taser hanging loose from her fingers. She was covered in ketchup and glass shards and coffee grounds, and she realized she was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together. The man looked at Wolf's body, at Scar still twitching on the floor, at the destruction of the diner, the shattered glass, the bullet holes in the wall. Then he looked at Isla. His eyes were the coldest thing she'd ever seen. Not cruel, just empty. The eyes of someone who'd looked at death so many times it had stopped meaning anything. He holstered the Desert Eagle in a shoulder rig under his coat. You. It wasn't a question. Isla's voice failed her. She tried to speak, but only a croak came out. One of the men in suits stepped forward, younger than the others, maybe late 20s, with slicked back hair and the kind of handsome that came from expensive grooming and knowing it. He looked at Isla like she was an insect. Boss, the situation's contained. What do you want us to do with her? The man, boss, Papa, whoever he was, shifted Callum to one arm. The boy had wrapped his legs around his father's waist, clinging like a drowning person to driftwood. "Mateo, check the perimeter. Make sure no one saw this." Mateo nodded and gestured to two of the other men. They moved toward the door, pulling out phones, coordinating. The man looked back at Isla. "Did you call the police?" Isla's brain stuttered back online. May had called 8 minutes ago. They'd be here any second. "My boss did." Something flickered across the man's face. Not anger, calculation. "Unfortunate." He stepped closer, and Isla realized exactly how big he was. Not bulky, but tall and broad-shouldered in a way that made the diner feel smaller. He towered over her, and she was still on the floor, glass cutting into her knees. "You saved him." Isla didn't know what to say to that. She'd thrown a napkin holder and a pot of coffee. She'd used a taser on a man trying to hurt a child. It hadn't been heroism. It had been panic. "You threw coffee. You broke his radius." The man gestured to Scar, who had stopped twitching and now lay motionless, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. "You used a taser on an armed assailant. Most people freeze. You moved." He reached into his coat pocket. Isla flinched, thinking gun, but he pulled out a handkerchief. White silk, monogrammed with initials too small to read in the dim light. He held it out to her. "Wipe your face, Miss Brennan." Isla's hand moved automatically, taking the handkerchief. Then her brain caught up. "How do you know my name?" "Your name tag." Isla looked down. Right. The plastic rectangle pinned to her shirt, black letters on white. Isla. But he'd said her last name, Brennan. That wasn't on the tag. The man's mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I know everything about everyone in a 5-mile radius of my son at all times." Isla Marie Brennan, 24 years old, born at Swedish Medical Center. Father, Connor Brennan, deceased 2007, former Navy SEAL. Mother, Patricia Brennan, deceased March 2017, lung cancer. Brother, Finn Brennan, 19, sophomore at University of Washington, architecture program. You live in a studio apartment on Capitol Hill, Unit 2B. You have $42,000 in medical debt. You work 2 jobs. You've never been arrested. You don't own a gun. You play chess. Isla's mouth went dry. She clutched the handkerchief, the silk soft against her bleeding palms. "Who are you?" "My name is Garrett Hale. This is my son Callum." The name hit Isla like cold water. Garrett Hale. She knew that name. Everyone in Seattle knew that name, even if they only whispered it. Real estate mogul on paper. Owned half the commercial properties downtown. But the rumors, the ones people didn't say out loud, painted a different picture. Money laundering. Organized crime. The kind of man who made people disappear when they became problems. And she'd just saved his son. Garrett Hale looked at Callum, who had his face buried in his father's shoulder, small hands fisted in the expensive fabric of his coat. "The men who attacked you tonight worked for Silas Cade. He broke a truce. He tried to take what belongs to me." His voice dropped, turning into something low and deadly. "He will burn for it." Isla found her voice, shaky and thin. "Okay, I'm glad your son is safe, really. But I've told you what happened. The police are coming. Can I go home now, please?" Garrett Hale looked at her with an expression that might have been pity on someone else's face. "No, Miss Brennan, you can't." The words didn't make sense. Isla stood up, her legs unsteady, glass falling from her jeans. "What do you mean I can't?" "Because Cade's men failed, and now they know your face. You're the witness who can identify them. You're the woman who humiliated Cade's soldiers. If I let you walk out that door, you'll be dead before sunrise." The diner spun. Isla grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. "So, what? I'm a prisoner?" "You're a guest, until I deal with the threat. You'll stay where I can see you, where I can protect you." "And how long will that take?" Garrett Hale's expression didn't change. "As long as it takes." Before Isla could argue, before she could scream or run or do any of the 1,000 things her brain was suddenly screaming at her to do, The library door creaked open. Mateo, the slicked-back one, stuck his head in. "Boss, police are 2 minutes out. We need to move." Garrett nodded once. He looked at Isla, and his tone shifted into something that allowed no argument. "You're coming with us." "What? No, I'm not going anywhere with you." Two of the men in suits moved forward, flanking her. They didn't touch her, but their presence made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. Isla scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The counter pressed against her spine. "This is kidnapping." Garrett Hale turned toward the door, carrying Callum, his voice floating back over his shoulder. "Call it protective custody. Welcome to the family, Miss Brennan." The men grabbed her arms. Not rough, but firm. The kind of grip that said struggling would be pointless. Isla twisted, trying to break free, but they lifted her off her feet like she weighed nothing. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat raw and desperate. May, call the police again. Tell them they took me. Tell them." One of the men, older, with gray at his temples and scars on his knuckles, spoke quietly. "Ma'am, the owner is locked in the freezer. She can't hear you. And by the time she gets out, we'll be gone. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." They carried her toward the door, toward the black SUVs idling in the parking lot, rain still pouring from the sky, the neon sign of the iron skillet buzzing and flickering in the darkness. Isla thrashed, trying to plant her feet, but the men were too strong, too practiced. They'd done this before. Garrett Hale was already in the lead vehicle, Callum still in his arms. He didn't look back, didn't watch them drag Isla toward the second SUV. She was a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied up, nothing more. The men pushed her into the back seat, one on each side of her, sandwiching her between bodies that smelled like gun oil and cologne. The doors slammed shut with the heavy thunk of reinforced steel. The windows were tinted so dark that the world outside became just a blur of streetlights and rain. The driver put the car in gear, and they pulled out of the parking lot, smooth and fast. Isla craned her neck, looking back at the diner, at the only place she'd felt safe in the 2 years since her mother died. May would be okay. May was smart, resourceful. She'd tell the police what happened. They'd look for Isla. But even as she thought it, she knew the truth. Men like Garrett Hale didn't get caught. They didn't leave witnesses who could testify. They operated in the spaces between laws, in the gray areas where money and violence intersected, and regular people like Isla didn't stand a chance. She thought about Finn, about the text message she'd never answered, about the $800 she'd promised to send on Friday. Who would take care of him now? Who would make sure he finished school, that he didn't drop out to look for her? The man on her left, the one with gray hair, spoke softly. "What's your name, son?" It took Isla a second to realize he was talking to her. "Isla." "Miss Isla, my name is Thomas. I've worked for Mr. Hale for 16 years. I'm going to tell you something true, and I need you to listen. Mr. Hale doesn't hurt people who don't deserve it. You saved his son tonight. That means something. He's not going to let anything happen to you. Understand?" Isla turned to look at him. Thomas had kind eyes, the wrinkles around them deep from smiling, but his jaw was set in a way that said he'd do whatever Garrett Hale told him to do, kindness or not. "He just kidnapped me." "He prevented Cade from killing you. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm sitting." Thomas's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Fair enough." They drove in silence after that. Isla tried to memorize the route. Left on 4th, right onto I-90, heading east across the lake. The floating bridge stretched ahead of them, the water black and choppy beneath. They took the exit for Mercer Island, winding through neighborhoods where houses sat behind gates and walls, where lawns were measured in acres instead of feet. After 20 minutes, the lead SUV slowed and turned onto a private road. Massive iron gates swung open automatically, revealing a driveway lined with ancient Douglas firs. The trees were huge, old growth, the kind that had been here since before Seattle was a city. At the end of the driveway, lit by landscape lights that made it look like something from a movie, stood a mansion. It wasn't the biggest house Isla had ever seen. It was too elegant for that, too carefully designed. Tudor revival, her mind supplied. probably built in the 1920s when Mercer Island was still farmland and timber barons built summer homes to escape the city. 14,000 square feet, maybe more. Slate roof, leaded glass windows, stone walls covered in ivy that looked professionally maintained. The cars stopped in front of the main entrance. Garrett Hale was already out of the lead vehicle, still carrying Callum, who had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder. He climbed the stone steps, and the front doors opened before he reached them. A woman stood in the entrance, mid-50s, wearing a crisp black dress and a white apron, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She took in Garrett, took in the sleeping child, and her expression didn't change. "Dr. Carter is waiting in the East Wing, sir." Garrett nodded and disappeared inside. Thomas opened Isla's door. "Come on, Miss Isla, let's get you cleaned up." Isla climbed out on shaking legs. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that made her bones feel like they were made of lead. She followed Thomas up the steps, through doors that were 12 feet tall and carved with scenes from medieval hunts. The foyer beyond was enormous, double-height ceilings, a chandelier that looked like a waterfall of crystals, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, oil paintings on the walls, the kind that belonged in museums, not houses. Isla felt small, dirty, out of place. The woman in the apron looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Hale has instructed that you be shown to the guest wing. Third door on the left, upstairs. I've left clothes in your size in the closet. The bathroom is stocked with toiletries. If you need anything, there's a phone on the nightstand. Dial 0. Her voice was clipped, British accent, the kind that came from years of practice and a fundamental belief that Isla was beneath her station. "Thank you," Isla managed. The woman didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her shoes clicking on the marble. Thomas gestured toward the grand staircase. "I'll show you up." They climbed in silence. Isla's hand trailed along the banister, mahogany smooth as glass. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched in both directions, lined with more paintings, more evidence of wealth so vast it stopped feeling real. Thomas opened the third door on the left. The room beyond was larger than Isla's entire apartment. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, the kind with curtains that could be drawn for privacy. A sitting area with a couch and 2 chairs. A fireplace, not gas but actual wood burning, already lit and crackling. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked gardens that glowed under carefully placed lights. "Get some sleep, Miss Isla. Dr. Carter will check on you in the morning. Make sure you're not injured." "I'm fine." Thomas looked at her hands, at the cuts from the broken glass, the blood dried brown on her palms. "You're not, but you will be." He closed the door and Isla heard the soft click of a lock. She tried the handle. It turned, not locked. But when she opened the door, a man in a black suit stood in the hallway, hands clasped in front of him, expression neutral. "Evening, miss. Mr. Hale has instructed that you're free to move about the house, but for your safety, I'll need to accompany you." Isla closed the door. She walked to the bed and sat down, her body moving on autopilot. The mattress was soft, too soft, the kind that probably cost $10,000. She looked down at her hands, at the cuts, at the blood, at the handkerchief Garrett Hale had given her, still clutched in her fist. She thought about Callum, about the way he'd whispered "Papa," about the bruises on his arm, about the terror in his eyes when the men with guns had come for him. She thought about Garrett Hale, about the way he'd shot Wolf without hesitation, about the coldness in his voice when he'd said, "You're coming with us." She thought about her father, about the chessboard, about sacrifice at the right moment, and she realized, with a sick certainty that settled in her stomach like stones, that she'd just made a move she couldn't take back. The board had changed. The pieces were in motion. And Isla Brennan, 24-year-old waitress with a dead-end job and a mountain of debt, had walked into a game where the stakes were measured in lives instead of dollars. She didn't know the rules, didn't know the players, didn't know how to win, but she knew, with absolute clarity, that losing meant dying. Isla woke to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't recognize, in a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud, wearing silk pajamas she hadn't put on herself. Panic hit before memory. her hand reaching for the nightstand where her phone should be, finding only polished mahogany and a glass of water someone had left while she slept. Then it came back in pieces. The diner, the guns, the boy named Callum, the man named Garrett Hale who'd stolen her life with 6 words. "You're coming with us." She sat up too fast, the room tilted, her vision graying at the edges. The clock on the mantel read 9:47 a.m. She'd slept for 9 hours. She never slept for 9 hours. The cuts on her palms had been cleaned and bandaged while she was unconscious, white gauze wrapped precisely around each hand. Someone had undressed her, washed the coffee and ketchup from her skin, put her in clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. The violation of it made her stomach turn. A soft knock preceded the door opening. The woman from last night entered, carrying a tray with coffee and toast, her expression no warmer in daylight. "Mr. Hale expects you in the sunroom at 10:30. Don't keep him waiting." She set the tray on the desk and left before Isla could form words. The coffee smelled expensive, the toast cut into perfect triangles, butter and jam arranged on a china plate like something from a hotel. Isla's mouth watered despite herself. She hadn't eaten since her shift started at 4 p.m. yesterday, 16 hours ago, and her body didn't care about pride or anger or the fact that she was a prisoner in a mansion. She ate standing up, too wired to sit, and found the closet the woman had mentioned. Inside hung clothes in her exact size. Jeans that actually fit her 26-inch waist, sweaters in charcoal and navy, undergarments still in packaging. Someone had taken her measurements while she slept, or already knew them, which was worse. She dressed in jeans and a gray pullover, both softer than anything she'd ever owned, and hated how good they felt against her skin. The guard was still outside when she opened the door. Different man, younger, but the same empty politeness. "The sunroom is downstairs, miss. I'll show you." He led her through hallways lined with photographs in silver frames, black and white images of men in suits from decades past, formal portraits of women in pearls, a wedding photo from the 1980s that showed a younger Garrett Hale next to a woman who took Isla's breath away. Same dark hair, same bone structure, same eyes. Ilara Hale, the nameplate read. 1985 to 2017, dead at 32. The same age Isla's mother had been when the cancer started. The sunroom sat at the back of the house, glass walls overlooking gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Garrett Hale sat at a round table, reading a newspaper, a cup of espresso untouched beside him. Across from him, Callum stared at a chessboard, his small forehead creased in concentration. Between them, the board showed a game in progress, white dominating, black struggling. Garrett looked up as Isla entered. His suit today was navy, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in the only concession to casual she'd seen from him. In daylight, she could see details she'd missed. The scar along his jawline, faint and old. The calluses on his knuckles. The way he held himself with the stillness of someone trained to violence but disciplined enough to contain it. "Sit, not a request." Isla sat in the empty chair, her hands folded in her lap to hide the shaking. A server appeared from nowhere, placing a plate of eggs and fruit in front of her. The woman from before, watching Isla like she was an insect that had wandered into a palace. "I need to call my brother." Garrett turned a page of his newspaper, not looking at her. "Your brother has been informed that you've taken a temporary position as a live-in companion for a family in the San Juan Islands. High-paying, 6-week contract. He believes you're safe and happy." Isla's chest constricted. "You lied to him." "I protected him. If Finn knows where you are, Kate's people will find him and use him to get to you. Is that what you want?" The logic was airtight and infuriating. Isla's nails bit into her palms through the bandages. No. "Good." Callum moved a bishop, his hand trembling slightly. The piece clicked against the board, a sound too loud in the quiet room. Garrett glanced at the board and sighed, disappointment radiating from him like cold. "Careless. You've exposed your king." He reached for the piece to demonstrate the mistake and Callum flinched. A tiny movement, barely visible, but Isla saw it. The way the boy's shoulders hunched, the way his breathing quickened. Fear. Of his father. Of making another mistake. "Wait!" Isla's voice came out sharper than intended. Garrett's hand froze. He looked at her with those empty gray eyes, and Isla felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "Excuse me?" "He didn't expose his king. He's setting a trap." She stood, moving to the board before her brain could catch up with her mouth, pointed to the black knight Callum had positioned 3 moves ago, the one that looked irrelevant in the corner. "If you take the bishop, his knight takes your rook here. Then he castles, and you're in forced mate in 4 moves. Silence crashed over the sunroom. The server stopped pouring coffee midstream. Even the light seemed to hold its breath. Garrett Hales studied the board, his eyes tracking the moves Isla had outlined, seeing the trap Callum had laid beneath the apparent blunder. Understanding dawned slow and terrible across his face. He looked at his son. "Did you plan that?" Callum nodded, his voice barely audible. "Isla showed me. In my head." Garrett's gaze swung to Isla, and she saw genuine surprise there, maybe the first authentic emotion she'd witnessed from him. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You play." "My father taught me." The words came out before Isla could stop them, before she could remember that showing competence to dangerous men was a mistake. "Navy SEAL. Died when you were 12. He used chess to teach you tactical thinking." Isla's throat closed. Hearing Garrett recite her father's death like reading ingredients off a cereal box made her want to scream. "We didn't have money for video games. We had a board." "You have a sharp mind for a waitress." The condescension in his voice lit something hot and reckless in Isla's chest. "Waiting tables is strategy. Managing time, predicting needs, dealing with people who think they own the place because they're paying for a $10 breakfast." She held his stare, refusing to look away first, refusing to apologize for the implied insult. For a long moment, Garrett Hale said nothing. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. "Touché." The door burst open. A man strode in without knocking, younger than Garrett, maybe late 20s, with slicked back hair and the kind of expensive grooming that screamed new money trying to look old. His suit was too flashy, his watch too large, his cologne too strong. Everything about him was too much. "Garrett, we've got a problem at the docks." Garrett's expression shuddered instantly, the almost smile vanishing like it had never existed. He stood, 6'3" of controlled danger, and suddenly the room felt smaller. "Callum, go to your room. Isla, go with him." "But—" "Now." The word cracked like a whip. Isla grabbed Callum's hand, the boy's fingers small and cold in hers, and pulled him toward the door. As they left, she heard Garrett's voice drop to something low and lethal. "Talk. And this better be worth interrupting breakfast, Reese." Reese. The name snagged in Isla's memory as she climbed the stairs with Callum, his hand still gripping hers like a lifeline. The slicked back hair, the arrogant energy. This was Garrett's cousin, the underboss, the second in command who would inherit everything if something happened to the heir. If something happened to Callum. Callum's room was on the 3rd floor, massive and lonely despite being filled with toys. A train set that probably cost thousands sat untouched in one corner. A basketball hoop, regulation height, dominated one wall. Shelves of books organized by color rather than content, decorator choices, not a child's preferences. In the center of the room, a desk covered in papers. Isla moved closer. Blueprints, dozens of them, hand-drawn in pencil with the kind of precision that shouldn't be possible for a 6-year-old. Buildings, bridges, houses with elaborate security features. Safe rooms, panic buttons, escape routes. "Did you draw these?" Callum nodded, crawling onto his bed and pulling a stuffed elephant into his lap. The toy looked well-loved, fur matted from years of handling, one ear sewn back on with careful stitches. "I want to build safe places, so the bad men can't get in." Isla's heart cracked. This child, heir to an empire built on violence, just wanted walls thick enough to keep the world out. She sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to crowd him. "You're really good at chess, Cal." "Papa wants me to be strong, like him." You are strong. Being smart is strength. Callum looked at her with those gray eyes that were too old for his face. Mama used to say that, before the car. The car. The accident that killed Alara Hale in December 2017 left Callum motherless at 4 years old, left Garrett Hale a widower who looked at his son and saw weakness instead of grief. Isla's mind flashed to the conversation she'd overheard Callum whisper yesterday. Uncle Reese said good thing the brakes failed when they did. Not an accident. Murder. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She forced her voice to stay calm, casual. Do you miss her? Every day. She smelled like vanilla. She sang when she made breakfast. She didn't like Papa's job. Callum reached under his bed and pulled out a shoebox. Inside, dozens of drawings. Not blueprints this time, but sketches of a woman with long dark hair and a smile that lit up the page. In every drawing, Alara Hale looked happy. In every drawing, Garrett was nowhere to be seen. Isla? Callum's voice was small, fragile. Don't leave me, please. The boy who had everything, mansion, toys, guards, was begging a stranger not to abandon him. Isla thought about her escape plan, the one she'd been forming since she woke up. The guard rotations, the exits, the phone in her room she could use to call 911. She thought about Finn, about her life, about the diner and May and the $127 that wouldn't matter if Cade's people killed her. Then she looked at Callum's face and saw herself at 12, kneeling beside her father's body, knowing she was about to become the adult in a family that still had a child who needed raising. I'm not going anywhere, Cal, I promise. The words came out before she could evaluate whether they were true, whether she meant them, whether making promises to a crime lord's son was the stupidest thing she'd ever done. But Callum's face transformed. Relief and hope and something that looked like the first breath after drowning. He hugged her, sudden and fierce, his small arms wrapping around her waist. 2 weeks bled into each other like watercolors in rain. Isla fell into a routine that felt less like captivity and more like purgatory with excellent meals. Breakfast with Callum at 8, lessons until noon, teaching him history and mathematics and chess theory. Lunch in the garden when the weather allowed. Afternoons in the library while Callum drew his blueprints and Isla read books she'd never had time for when she was working 2 jobs. Garrett was gone most days, returning late at night, smelling of cigar smoke and something that might have been gunpowder. Isla heard his footsteps in the hall sometimes, pausing outside her door, never knocking. She didn't know what he wanted, didn't want to know. She kept her head down, played chess with Callum, taught the boy that there were ways to be strong that didn't involve becoming his father. But she noticed things. She'd always been good at noticing things, at reading the subtext of a room, at seeing the patterns people thought they hid. The security shift changed at 6 p.m. exactly, the rotation timed with military precision. The back pantry was unlocked between 2 and 3 p.m. when the delivery drivers came. Thomas, the kind-eyed guard, walked the west perimeter every night at midnight. Same route, same timing. And Reese? Reese came by often, too often, always when Garrett was gone. He prowled the house like he owned it, treating the staff like servants instead of people, watching Isla with eyes that made her skin crawl. She avoided him when she could, locked her door when she couldn't. On the 15th night, a storm knocked out power in the West Wing. Isla was walking down the hall toward the supply closet, looking for candles, when she heard voices coming from the library. The door was cracked open, lamplight spilling through. She should have kept walking. Should have remembered that curiosity killed more than cats. But she heard Garrett's name and her feet stopped moving. He's getting weak, Marco. Reese's voice, pitched low but audible through the gap. Distracted by the boy, and now this girl. Another voice, deeper, gravelly, older. Garrett is cautious. That's kept us alive for 20 years. Cautious is another word for scared. Cade's offering a truce if we give up the downtown ports. Garrett says no. He wants war. I say we make the deal while Garrett isn't around to stop it. Silence. Then the older voice, careful. That's treason, Reese. That's survival. You want to go down with him when Cade comes? When the feds finally get their warrant? Garrett's playing a losing game, and I'm not dying for his pride. Isla's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the gasp. Treason. Conspiracy. Reese was planning to betray Garrett, to sell him out to Cade or the FBI or whoever would pay the best price. And Marco, whoever he was, wasn't saying no. A floorboard creaked under her foot. "Who's there?" Reese's shout cut through the darkness. Isla didn't wait. She kicked off her slippers and ran, her bare feet silent on the hardwood, diving into the linen closet 3 doors down, just as the library door flew open. She pressed herself against the back wall, between sheets that smelled like lavender, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought they'd hear it. Probably just the wind, Marco's voice, uncertain. Footsteps in the hall, heavy boots coming closer. Isla held her breath, counted seconds, prayed to a god she'd stopped believing in when her father died. "Check the perimeter anyway. I don't like it." The footsteps retreated. Isla waited in the darkness, counting to 300 before she dared to move. When she finally crept out, the hallway was empty, but her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. She knew too much. If Reese found her, if he suspected she'd overheard, she was dead. Garrett had said she was safe here, protected. But what did protection mean when the threat was inside the walls? She went straight to Garrett's study. It was empty, locked. But the door was solid oak, and the lock was a joke compared to what she'd picked as a teenager sneaking out to meet friends. 30 seconds with a hairpin from her room, and the door swung open. The study was exactly what she expected. Massive desk, leather chairs, bookshelves full of first editions no one had ever read. But it was also a command center. Monitors on one wall showing security feeds, a gun safe built into the floor, filing cabinets that probably contained enough evidence to put Garrett away for life. Isla moved to the desk, looking for something, anything that would tell her how to reach Garrett, how to warn him that his cousin was planning a coup. She found phones with no labels, folders marked with codes she didn't understand, a ledger written in shorthand that might as well have been Latin, and a photograph, face down in the top drawer. She flipped it over. Ilara Hale stood on a beach somewhere warm, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her smile genuine and bright. She held Callum, maybe 2 years old, on her hip, and she was looking at whoever held the camera with an expression Isla recognized because she'd seen it on her own mother's face before the sickness. Love. Uncomplicated, fierce, absolute. Garrett had kept this photo hidden in a drawer, face down, like he couldn't bear to look at what he'd lost. Isla was still holding the photograph when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the guard's measured pace. Faster. Angry. She shoved the photo back in the drawer and ducked behind the desk just as the door opened. Garrett walked in, his coat soaked from rain she hadn't heard start, his hair disheveled, a fresh bandage on his forearm spotted with blood. He moved to the desk, poured 3 fingers of bourbon from a decanter, and drank it in one swallow. Then he poured another and stood there, staring at nothing, his shoulders tight with exhaustion, or pain, or both. Isla stayed perfectly still. She was going to get caught. There was no way out without him seeing her. Her mind raced through explanations, excuses, anything that wouldn't sound like "I was snooping through your private office." Garrett set the glass down and opened the top drawer, pulled out the photograph, stared at it with an expression that made Isla's throat close. Not cold, not empty, devastated. The mask had slipped, and underneath was a man who'd lost something he'd never stopped mourning. "I'm sorry, Ella." His voice was barely audible, meant for ghosts. "I tried to quit. You asked me to quit. And I said after Callum turned 10, we'd disappear. New names, new lives. Somewhere you could garden, and Callum could go to normal school, and no one would try to kill us for territory, or revenge, or profit." He touched the photograph like it might break. "But you died when he was 4, and I couldn't leave, because leaving means weakness, and weak men get their families killed. So I stayed, and I built walls, and I turned into the thing you hated most, the thing I swore I'd never become." He put the photograph back, face down, and closed the drawer. Isla watched him walk to the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass, and realized she was seeing something no one was meant to see. The private grief of a man who'd buried his humanity with his wife and told himself it was necessary. Garrett Hale wasn't just a crime lord. He was a father who didn't know how to be soft, a widower who'd armored himself against feeling anything, because feeling meant remembering what he'd lost. He stood there for 5 minutes that felt like hours. Then he left, closing the door behind him, and Isla finally breathed. She waited until his footsteps faded completely before crawling out from behind the desk, her legs numb from kneeling, her heart still racing. She needed to tell him about Reese. But how? How did she explain that she'd been eavesdropping, that she'd broken into his study, that she'd witnessed him at his most vulnerable? And would he even believe her, or would he think she was trying to manipulate him, to gain leverage? The answer came at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, couldn't stop hearing Reese's voice. Garrett's playing a losing game, and I'm not dying for his pride. She got dressed in the dark, jeans and a sweater, and went downstairs. Garrett's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, the master suite at the end of the east wing. She'd never been inside, never been invited, but she knew which door was his from the guard posted outside. The guard stood as she approached. "Miss Brennan, it's late." "I need to see Garrett. It's urgent." "Mr. Hale is asleep." "Wake him." The guard's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Calculation. Weighing protocol against the steel in Isla's voice. Isla waited in the library, the same room where Reese had plotted treason, her nerves stretched wire-tight. When Garrett entered, he'd pulled on a sweater but still looked disheveled, unguarded. He closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. "Talk." "I heard Reese. Tonight. He was talking to someone named Marco. They're planning to betray you." Garrett's expression went very still. "You're certain it was Reese?" "I know his voice. I saw him leave the room. He said you're weak, that you're distracted by Callum and me. He said Cade's offering a truce for the downtown ports, and Reese wants to take the deal while you're not around to stop it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Garrett moved to the window, his back to her, and Isla couldn't read him, couldn't tell if he believed her or thought she was lying. "Marco Santos, my father's best friend, held me when I was a baby, taught me to shoot." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Isla heard the fracture underneath. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't change facts." He turned to face her, and the emptiness was back in his eyes. "You risked confronting me to tell me this? Why?" "Because Callum needs you alive." "Is that the only reason?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Isla wasn't ready to examine. She thought about the photograph, about the man who'd apologized to a ghost, about the father who didn't know how to hold his son without crushing him. "I don't know." Garrett moved closer, predatory grace, until he stood inches away. He reached out, his rough hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, completely at odds with everything she knew about him. "You're a strange creature, Isla Brennan. You should be running from me. Instead, you're saving me again." "I'm saving Callum. If you die, he has no one." "Is that the only reason?" His face was inches from hers. She could smell the bourbon and rain, could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her heart hammered, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something more dangerous, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering what it would be like to jump. "Garrett." He leaned in. His lips brushed hers, a feather-light touch that sent electricity down her spine, a question more than a demand. Isla froze, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, dangerous, a complication she couldn't afford. But her body didn't listen. Her eyes closed, her hand came up to his chest, feeling his heartbeat, fast and hard beneath her palm. Then he pulled back abruptly, grimacing, his hand going to his bandaged forearm. "You're bleeding." "Business dispute, nothing serious." "Let me fix it. I have doctors." "You have a traitor in your house. Do you want to wake the doctor and risk Reese finding out I told you? Or do you want to trust the waitress?" Garrett stared at her for a long moment. Then he sat on the leather couch and held out his arm. The bandage was soaked through, red seeping into white. Trust the waitress. Isla found the first aid kit in the bathroom attached to the library, the kind stocked for emergencies, and brought it back. She unwrapped the bandage carefully. The wound underneath was a graze, bullet or knife, shallow but long, oozing blood that hadn't clotted properly. She cleaned it with antiseptic, her hands steady despite everything, and applied butterfly stitches to pull the edges together. Garrett watched her work, his jaw clenched against pain he refused to show. Where did you learn field medicine? Phlebotomy course. Didn't finish, but I learned enough. Why didn't you finish? My mother got sick, had to quit to take care of her. And when she died, you took care of your brother instead. Isla didn't answer. She wrapped a fresh bandage around his arm, tight but not cutting off circulation, and tied it off with practiced efficiency. There, don't get it wet for 48 hours. Change the dressing twice a day. Dr. Brennan. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Isla's chest tightened at the sight, at how much younger it made him look, how human. I need to deal with Reese. How? That's not your concern. He's planning to kill you, Garrett. That makes it my concern. Garrett stood, testing his arm, and nodded approval at her work. Reese won't kill me. He'll try to maneuver me into a position where someone else does it for him, probably Cade. Clean hands, plausible deniability, classic power play. So what do we do? We? His eyebrow rose. There is no we, Isla. You're not part of this war. I became part of it the moment I stepped between Callum and a gun. You don't get to decide I'm not involved when it's convenient. Something flickered across Garrett's face. Respect, maybe? Or the beginning of something more dangerous. He stepped closer again, invading her space, his voice dropping low. You have no idea what you're asking for. This isn't chess. The pieces are people, and when they fall, they don't go back in the box. They bleed. They beg. They die screaming. I know. Isla held his stare. But Callum is 6 years old, and he draws blueprints of safe houses because he's terrified the bad men will come back. So I don't care about your war or your empire or whether Reese thinks you're weak. I care that a little boy gets to grow up with a father who's alive to see it. Garrett's hand came up to her face again, but this time he didn't pull away. He kissed her, hard and desperate and nothing like the question from before. This was a demand, a claiming. A man who'd spent 2 years burying every feeling, suddenly letting one surface. Isla kissed him back before she could think better of it, her hands fisting in his sweater, pulling him closer. Then reality crashed back. She broke away, stepping back until the desk pressed against her spine. This can't happen. Why not? Because you're holding me here against my will. Because you're a criminal. Because I have a life to get back to, and you're not part of it. Garrett's expression shuddered. You're right. This was a mistake. He moved toward the door, then paused, his back to her. Stay in your room tomorrow. Don't come out for any reason. What I'm about to do, you don't need to see. Then he was gone, and Isla was alone in the library, her lips still burning from a kiss that should never have happened, her hands shaking from adrenaline or desire, or the terrifying realization that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, she'd stopped seeing Garrett Hale as her captor and started seeing him as a man who needed saving as much as his son did. November 24th, 2019. The day after Isla had stopped Garrett from becoming the man his wife feared he'd turn into. The gala wasn't until 7 p.m., 6 hours from now, and Garrett's command to stay hidden felt less like protection and more like being sidelined from a war she'd already joined. Isla waited until noon, when the house settled into its midday lull, then slipped downstairs using the servants' passages Thomas had inadvertently shown her during their careful walks through the frost-covered gardens. The basement stretched beneath the mansion like a different world, all concrete and steel instead of polished mahogany and Waterford crystal. She followed voices to a room at the corridor's end, a space that reeked of mildew and something darker she didn't want to name. The door stood cracked open. Through the gap, Garrett loomed over a chair where Reese sat bound, his cultivated pretty boy face already morphing into something purple and swollen. But Garrett wasn't hitting him. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, staring at his cousin with an expression that made Isla's stomach clench. Not rage, grief. You were 12 when my father died. I was 19. I became your guardian, your brother, the only family you had left after your mother drowned herself in pills and vodka. I paid for your college, gave you position in the organization, trusted you with everything that mattered. Reese spat blood onto concrete. And you got soft. Alara made you soft, and when she died, you got worse. Walking around like a corpse, pretending to be some kind of father when we both know Callum would be better off at boarding school where he can't see what you really are. The slap came faster than Isla's eye could track. Reese's head whipped sideways, a tooth pinging off the floor. Don't say my wife's name, and don't ever speak about my son. Your son is terrified of you. Your wife hated what you'd become, and now you're building an empire on quicksand because you won't make the hard calls. Cade's offering peace, and you want war because your pride can't handle bending. Garrett's hand moved to his waistband. Isla's breath caught, certain she was about to witness an execution. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed. Marco, South Basement, now. 3 minutes crawled past. Then the door swung wide, and an older man entered, 65, maybe older, with silver hair and a face that looked like weathered granite. He saw Reese bleeding in the chair and registered zero surprise. Garrett, what's this about? How long have you been planning to betray me? Marco's eyes flicked to Reese, back to Garrett. No denial, no shock, just exhausted relief, like a man who'd been holding his breath for months. 6 months, since you rejected Cade's first offer. Since it became clear you'd rather burn everything than compromise. The plan? Let Reese take over while you were conveniently removed from the equation. Nothing personal, kid. Just business. Garrett's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. My father trusted you. Your father was a pragmatist. He'd understand this is survival. My father would have put a bullet between your eyes for even thinking about betrayal. Marco shrugged, the gesture almost peaceful. Maybe, but your father's dead, and you're not him. That's the whole problem. Garrett drew the gun. Not the Desert Eagle, something smaller, a Glock that molded to his hand like it had been waiting there. He pressed the barrel against Marco's forehead, and the old man didn't even blink. Do it. Prove you still have what it takes. The safety clicked off. Isla watched Garrett's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the gold disappear from his gray eyes, replaced by something empty and final. Wait! The word tore from Isla before conscious thought. She shoved through the door, stepping between Garrett and the execution she knew would hollow him out from the inside. Garrett's head snapped toward her, shock fracturing the ice. I told you to stay upstairs. And I told you I don't follow orders from men who kidnap waitresses. Reese's laugh came wet and broken. Perfect. Garrett Hale, brought to his knees by a girl who serves coffee for tips. Isla ignored him. She moved to Garrett, close enough to feel heat radiating from his body, and placed her hand over the gun. His whole arm trembled. Not much, but enough. Don't do this. He betrayed me. They both deserve to die. Maybe they do, but killing them makes you exactly what Alara feared you'd become. And Callum will grow up knowing his father executed family in a basement. Is that the legacy you want carved into his memory? Garrett's eyes searched hers, looking for permission or absolution or just a single reason to be something other than the monster everyone expected. They'll talk. Evidence to Cade, the FBI, whoever pays best. Then hand them to the FBI yourself. Immunity deal, controlled confession, whatever keeps you out of prison. But don't do this, please. The gun lowered, not dropped, just lowered to his side, still gripped white-knuckle tight. Marco released a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for decades. Garrett's voice came out sandpaper rough. Get them out of my sight. East storage. Lock them down until I decide. 2 guards materialized from shadows, dragging Reese upright, Marco following with raised hands. As they passed Isla, Reese leaned close enough that she smelled copper and expensive cologne. You think you saved him? You just delayed the inevitable. Garrett Hale is a dead man walking, and everyone standing next to him dies too. Then, silence. Just Isla and Garrett in a room that stank of violence and shattered trust. He holstered the weapon and turned away, shoulders rigid as iron. You shouldn't have come down here. Probably not. You shouldn't have stopped me. Definitely not. You have no idea what you've done. Marco knows everything. Routes, accounts, safe houses. If he talks, then you'll handle it. But you'll handle it as Garrett Hale, not as the ghost your wife was terrified you'd become. He spun, closing the distance in 2 strides, backing her against the wall. Not threatening, desperate. Why do you care what I become? Isla's pulse hammered against her throat. This close, she saw exhaustion carved into every line of his face, the weight of an empire built on blood and money that would never wash clean. Because Callum needs you, and because somewhere under all this armor, there's a man who kept his wife's photo hidden face down because looking at it hurt too much. That man deserves a chance to be something more than what fear made him. Garrett's hand cupped her face, thumb tracing her jawline. You see things that don't exist, Isla. You look at me and see redemption potential. I look in mirrors and see my father's eyes staring back. And the only difference is, I haven't put a gun in my mouth yet. Then don't. Choose differently. Be the father Callum needs, not the one you think you have to be. He kissed her, slower than before, less desperation and more discovery, like relearning something he'd forgotten existed. Isla kissed him back, hands sliding into his hair, pulling him closer even as rational thought screamed this was catastrophic judgment. He tasted like bourbon and regret, and when they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like hope. The gala is tonight, 7 p.m. at the Fairmont Olympic. You're coming with me. I'm not going to some charity event. I don't have appropriate clothes. I don't know. You're coming because I need someone watching my back who isn't on the payroll. Someone who sees the board like you do. He pulled a business card from his pocket, embossed gold, Marcella's Couture. Be there at 2 p.m. Marcella will handle everything. Garrett, please. The words stopped her. Garrett Hale didn't say please. Didn't ask. But here he was, asking. And the vulnerability in his voice made refusal impossible. If this goes sideways, I'm blaming you. Fair enough. Marcella's Couture occupied real estate that probably cost more per square foot than Isla's entire building. The woman who greeted her was 70 if she was a day. Silver hair swept into a French twist, posture suggesting decades of telling wealthy people they were wrong about fashion. Miss Brennan, Mr. Hale described you perfectly. Slight build, strong shoulders from labor, excellent bone structure being wasted on department store garbage. We're fixing that immediately. 2 hours later, Isla stood before a mirror and didn't recognize the reflection. The dress was emerald silk, backless, with a slit up the left thigh that stopped just short of scandalous. It moved like water when she walked, catching light in ways that made her skin luminous. Marcella had done something to her hair, sweeping it up to expose her neck, her collarbones, elegant lines she'd never noticed through exhaustion. This costs more than I make in 6 months, Marcella sniffed. This costs more than you make in a year, and Mr. Hale is paying, so stop counting dollars and start counting the hearts you're going to stop. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel had survived the Depression and 2 wars and still looked like European royalty had colonized downtown Seattle. Isla arrived in a car worth more than her theoretical college education and climbed marble steps while photographers shouted questions she didn't answer. Garrett waited at the top in a tuxedo tailored to make mortal men look divine. He saw her, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise, recognition. Like he'd known she could look like this all along and was just waiting for the world to catch up. He offered his arm. You look devastating. I look like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's life. Good, that makes 2 of us. They entered together, moving through Seattle's elite like apex predators through a reef. Isla recognized faces from magazines: the mayor, working donors, tech billionaires who'd made fortunes on apps she didn't understand, society wives wearing jewelry that could fund hospitals, and Silas Cade. He stood near the bar, 55 and built like the Marine he'd been before deciding violence paid better outside the military. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, like money couldn't quite smooth the rough edges underneath. When he spotted Garrett, his face split into a smile that never touched his eyes.
Garrett Hale, and this must be the famous Shield, the woman who threw coffee at my men.
Cade's voice carried across marble, drawing attention. Conversation stopped. People turned, sensing blood. Garrett's hand tightened on Isla's waist.
Silas, enjoying the wine? I hear it's a vintage year for betrayal.
Funny, I was about to say the same. Heard you had staffing issues recently. Shame about Marco. Good man. Knew when to cut losses.
He knew when to make the wrong choice. There's a difference.
Cade stepped closer, violating polite distance. I have a proposal, Garrett. Surrender the downtown ports, and we call this unpleasantness finished. You keep your house, your son, your pretty new companion. I get commercial waterfront access. Everyone wins.
My answer hasn't changed.
That's unfortunate, because Port Authority is raiding your warehouses tonight. Anonymous tip about illegal shipments. You'll be in federal custody by midnight. The words detonated like a bomb. Isla felt Garrett's body go rigid, saw calculation racing behind his eyes. This was endgame. Cade had outmaneuvered him, used Marco's intel to set a trap, and was announcing it publicly so Garrett couldn't retaliate with witnesses everywhere. Isla stepped forward, voice clear and steady. Actually, Mr. Cade, you might want to check your sources. The shipment isn't at the warehouses. Cade's smile faltered.
Excuse me?
Garrett moved the inventory 3 hours ago, to the old steel mill in Georgetown. If Port Authority raids the warehouses, all they'll find are empty crates and grounds for a harassment lawsuit. Complete fabrication. Isla had zero idea where Garrett's shipments were, but she delivered it with the confidence of someone announcing checkmate, with absolute certainty that came from seeing 3 moves ahead and knowing the opponent had already lost. Cade's face paled. He couldn't know if she was bluffing, couldn't risk assuming she was. If he'd paid for Marco's information, positioned Port Authority for a raid, and came up empty, his credibility would shatter. Garrett's hand found the small of Isla's back, subtle pressure that might have been approval or shock. Isla pressed forward, closing distance with Cade. And while we're sharing information, I hear the Cade family holds offshore assets, specifically Cayman accounts ending in 7743 and 8829. Would be unfortunate if the IRS received documentation about those accounts. Encrypted ledgers have ways of becoming decrypted when motivated people get involved. Pure invention. Random numbers she hoped sounded legitimate enough to plant doubt. Cade stared at her like she'd grown a second head.
You're bluffing.
Am I? You want to bet your empire on it? Silence stretched. Every eye in the ballroom locked on them. Seattle's power players, watching a waitress in emerald silk go toe-to-toe with a man who'd built his fortune on intimidation and violence. Cade looked at Garrett, at Isla, back to Garrett.
We'll talk later.
He turned and walked away, shoulders rigid with fury. The moment he was out of earshot, Garrett leaned close to Isla's ear.
Did I move the shipment?
No idea, but you're calling your people right now to make sure you do. A grin broke across Garrett's face, genuine and boyish and completely at odds with everything Isla knew about him.
You're magnificent.
I'm insane, and we need to leave, before Cade realizes I was guessing. They made it to the car before Garrett's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his expression went dark.
When? How many vehicles? Understood. Get everyone out. Burn the paperwork.
He hung up and looked at Isla.
Cade's people are moving, not Port Authority.
His own men, heading to intercept us on the route back to the estate. They're finishing what they started at the diner. Isla's mouth went dry. How many?
Enough.
Garrett leaned forward, giving the driver an address. Route 520, take the bridge. The driver nodded. They peeled away from the hotel into Seattle traffic, rain just starting to fall. Isla watched the city blur past, lights reflecting off slick streets, and realized she was about to survive another assassination attempt. Except this time, there was no diner counter to vault over. Just a car on a floating bridge over black water, and men with guns waiting in darkness. Listen carefully. Garrett's voice went hurricane calm. If something happens to me, you go back to the estate. Thomas will get you and Callum out of the country. Canada first, then wherever you want. Money, new identities, everything you need. But you have to promise me you'll protect him. Nothing's happening to you. Isla. No, I didn't stop you from killing Marco just so you could die on a bridge an hour later. We're both surviving this, and you're going home to read Callum a bedtime story like a normal father. Garrett's hand found hers in darkness, fingers lacing together. Normal fathers don't have body counts. Normal fathers don't raise sons who draw blueprints for safe houses. You work with what you have. The bridge stretched ahead, empty at 9:47 p.m., just their car and the trailing SUV with Garrett's security. Halfway across, headlights blazed to life behind them, two vehicles closing fast. Garrett's phone rang again. They're ahead of us too, blocking the exit. A third vehicle appeared in front, stopping perpendicular across both lanes, boxed in. Garrett pulled a gun from the glove compartment, checked the magazine, handed it to Isla. Safety's here. Point and shoot. Center mass. I've never fired a gun. Tonight's an excellent night to learn. The car behind rammed their bumper. Metal screamed. The driver fought for control. Another impact, harder, sending them spinning. The world tilted, gravity losing meaning, and they were airborne. The car hit the guardrail, punched through rusted metal that should have been replaced decades ago, and went over. For one weightless moment, Isla saw stars reflected in black water. Then impact. The crash drove air from her lungs. Water rushed through the shattered windshield, shockingly cold, filling the car faster than thought. Isla's seatbelt held her trapped, and she fumbled for the release with numb fingers, panic overriding everything her father had taught about staying calm. Garrett was already free, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He grabbed her face, forcing eye contact. Breathe. One deep breath, then we go. Isla sucked in air, tasting metal and terror. Garrett cut her seatbelt with a knife from somewhere, and they were swimming, kicking toward a surface 40 feet above. The water was so cold, it felt like being stabbed with ice. Isla's lungs burned, vision grayed. They broke surface together, gasping, treading water. The car sank beneath them, disappearing into darkness. On the bridge above, figures moved, flashlights cutting through rain, looking for bodies. Garrett's voice was hoarse from cold. Swim south, don't stop. They swam parallel to shore, staying low, using bridge supports as cover. Isla's dress was lead, dragging her down, but she kicked harder, refusing to drown, refusing to let Cade win. By the time they reached the embankment, her arms shook from exertion and hypothermia. Garrett hauled himself out first, then reached back to pull Isla up. They collapsed on muddy bank, shaking violently, alive. Isla's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting copper. Your leg. Garrett looked down. His left leg bent at an angle. Legs shouldn't bend. Blood soaking through torn tuxedo pants. Compound fracture. Maybe worse. Fantastic. Isla stripped off her ruined heels and assessed their situation. South side of the bridge approach, maybe half a mile from the nearest road. Garrett needed medical attention within the hour or shock would kill him. And Cade's people would search the shoreline within minutes. Can you stand? Not well. Then we crawl. She helped him up, taking his weight on her shoulders, and they stumbled into underbrush. Branches tore at Isla's dress, her skin, but she didn't stop. Behind them, voices carried on wind. Searching. Hunting. 20 yards before Garrett's leg gave out completely. He fell, biting back a scream, and Isla went down with him. Leave me. Get to the road. Flag down help. Not happening. Isla, I'm dead weight. You move faster without me. Funny, Callum said almost the same thing when I told him to hide under the table. Neither of you gets to decide you're expendable. Garrett's laugh came out wet and agonized.
Stubborn woman.
Terrible judge of character. Now shut up and let me think. Footsteps. Close. Too close. Isla looked around frantically, seeing only darkness and trees and distant house lights that might as well have been on the moon. Then she spotted it. A drainage culvert. Concrete pipe maybe 4 feet in diameter, half buried in the hillside. She dragged Garrett toward it, ignoring protests, ignoring her screaming muscles. They crawled inside just as flashlights swept over where they'd been.
They went in the water. No way they survived.
A second voice, uncertain.
Boss wants confirmation. Bodies. Then boss can dive himself. Water's 40 degrees, current strong. We got better things than fishing for corpses.
The footsteps retreated. Isla counted to 500 before daring to move, before believing they might actually survive. Garrett's skin was ice beneath her hand, breathing shallow, shock setting in. Stay with me. Talk to me.
About what?
Anything. Tell me about Alara. His eyes focused on hers, pupils dilated from pain and blood loss.
She was everything I wasn't. Soft where I was hard. Believed people were fundamentally good, even when I showed her evidence otherwise.
Wanted to adopt a dozen kids, open a foundation for foster children, save everyone. She sounds perfect. She was. And she died because I couldn't let go of this life. December 14th, 2017. Her car went off the road. Brake lines cut. I thought it was an accident for 2 years. 2 years I never questioned it. Reese. She was going to the FBI, found shipping manifests, offshore accounts, everything they needed to bury me. Reese discovered her plan and decided she was a liability. Garrett's hand found Isla's, gripping tight.
I failed her, promised to quit, to get out, and I stayed too long. My son paid the price. Watched his mother die because I couldn't walk away from money and power and things that matter less than nothing when you lose people you love.
Isla leaned her forehead against his. Then don't fail him again. Live. Get out of this culvert, fix that leg, and become the father she wanted you to be. And what about you? What about me? When this ends, when Kate is dealt with and you're free to leave, what happens to us? The question hung in cold darkness. Isla thought about her apartment, her diner job, the life she'd built from scraps and determination. She thought about Callum drawing blueprints, about Garrett keeping photos face down, about the way her pulse jumped when he touched her. I don't know, but we have to survive tonight before we worry about tomorrow. Garrett kissed her, cold lips tasting like lake water and blood, but underneath was warmth and promise and the faint possibility that broken people could find each other in darkness and become something whole. Sirens wailed in the distance, real police this time, or maybe Garrett's people, alerted by the security team in the trailing SUV. Isla held Garrett in a drainage pipe while rain fell harder, washing blood and mud toward the lake, and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't leaving, not while Cade was hunting them, not while Callum needed someone who'd stand between him and bullets, not when the man in her arms was finally becoming someone who deserved saving. The pieces were in motion, the endgame was coming, and Isla Brennan, who'd started as a waitress trying to survive until Friday, had become the queen on a board where losing meant death, but winning might mean finding something worth living for.